The other vote that just took place or didn't take place was in the Security Council this morning. The U.S. had offered a resolution that is being reported as a ceasefire or a temporary ceasefire resolution. And in fact, it's not. It is, aside from the, folks can quibble at the notion of like, is a temporary ceasefire really a ceasefire? Putting that aside, this resolution did not call for a ceasefire.
Yep.
It suggested a ceasefire. Now, that's an important distinction because the UN does, when the UN Security Council passes something, it is meaningful. It doesn't mean necessarily that they're going to do anything to uphold it, but it does have theoretically the force of international law. Here is a clip. Best explanation we can give you is Phyllis Bennis, who we've had on this program, but not for a long time, I think. A fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, was on with Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! And her explanation of this is probably the best one you will hear, to the extent you hear any on the mainstream press.
Phyllis, if you can talk about what the U.S. has introduced into the UN Security Council, it could be voted on today, and it also
Pause it for 1 second. We should make it clear. This was before it was vetoed by China and Russia.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Security Council. It could be voted on today, and it also what could be voted on are is the resolution that has been adopted by or sponsored by 8 of the elected members of the Security Council.
Thanks, Amy. You know, what we're looking at here is a lot of playing with words. What is different is the language of the Biden administration. We heard it yesterday from Secretary of State Blinken. We're hearing it from President Biden. We're hearing it from others, using the word ceasefire, saying immediate ceasefire in some cases. We're seeing the New York Times is saying that the U.S. is introducing a resolution at the Security Council calling for an immediate ceasefire. That's not the case. What the U.S. resolution calls for, and we should be clear, there has not been a formal distribution of what the U.S. is actually going to put on the table for the vote this morning. There's at least 3 different versions circulating around, but they're all about the same on the critical description. It's in the first paragraph, the first operative paragraph of the resolution, uses the language of an immediate ceasefire, but it doesn't actually call for a ceasefire. What it does is recognize the importance of a ceasefire and then says, and therefore we should support the negotiations that are underway in Doha, in Qatar. These are the negotiations that have been underway for weeks. They are mainly focused on the release of hostages, as well as the parameters of a short-term ceasefire, probably 6 weeks. But the key thing is that the U.S. draft does not call for an actual Security Council call for a ceasefire. The language of the 8 of the 10 elected members of the Security Council is much simpler and much more direct. It says explicitly that the Security Council demands an immediate ceasefire respected by all parties, leading to a sustainable ceasefire. Period, full stop. The U.S. language is very convoluted. It's various versions of the Security Council determines the imperative of an immediate and sustained ceasefire to protect civilians on all sides, and then says something about, and therefore we unequivocally support the negotiations that are underway. So it takes all of the authority out of the Security Council, makes the Council into essentially a group of cheerleaders for the existing negotiations that are underway, and takes away any additional pressure that an actual Security Council demand for an immediate ceasefire would have, because Security Council resolutions, as you know, Amy, and I think most of our listeners know, is part of international law. It's enforceable. It doesn't mean that it would be enforced, but it's a very powerful signal, something that an acknowledgement of the importance of a ceasefire is simply not that. It's not.
Yeah, that was my favorite explanation of it too, because it's actually quite cynical here. It's the United States thumbing its nose at the notion of international law, because it says in their resolution, while gesturing at a ceasefire and attempting, I think, to appease a global community that is turning its back on the United States and, of course, the domestic concerns for the Biden administration, using those words while undercutting the very enforcement mechanism of international law, which is supposed to be the United Nations. It's essentially in this language saying, we are the ones who still make the decision here as the brokers for these negotiations. It's really the United States and Israel and I guess the representatives of the Palestinian people within this context that are the ones who will make this decision. Well, then you don't have international law if that's the case. You don't have these kinds of standards. I
mean, I think at the end of the day, it's simple as the Biden administration feeling the pressure domestically, realizing that that support for arms sales to Israel is beginning to buckle a little bit in the Senate. And increasingly, they were going to lose about 15, 20 votes. I don't know what the ultimate vote was in terms of Democrats passing this budget, but they were going to lose that for their for the budget's suspension of UNRWA funding for a year. I think this is the Biden administration more or less, doing the same thing that Chuck Schumer was hoping to do when he came out against Netanyahu, which is the dynamic. The best way to think about it is a limited hangout. Mm-hmm. The existence of even that U.S. Fake call for a ceasefire would be indicative of the pressure that's building, and give license for other places to do stuff. I mean, we're starting to see like some countries in Europe who are starting to have a weapons embargo. Theoretically, it would allow a little bit of oxygen for that, but at the end of the day, it's also designed like a limited hangout to relieve some pressure and say we've done this, and that's why I think the reporting of it and the characterization of the ceasefire resolution that we get domestically, for the most part, has been not accurate. That it's not really. I mean, the point of a UN resolution is that it has the force of the Security Council behind it, or I should say a UN Security Council resolution. It has the force of the Security Council behind it. That means that all the major powers in the world are aligned in an agreement. And therefore, it allows other countries, including those countries, to rely on that ruling from the Security Council to justify domestic measures and also to create pressure on Israel. And so this was, I think this is about the U.S. trying to let the air out of the tires. And I think that's why basically China and Russia, I don't think they care about this, to be honest with you, but it's in their national interest to put pressure on the U.S. because the U.S. is taking, the Biden administration is taking such a outlier position. Oh, absolutely. It's in their interest as well not to, it's in their interest to essentially show and not give the United States an out here and say that like this resolution is sufficient, because it's not. And those language differences are important. But, what I think, Phyllis said there at the beginning is also notable, that the language of the United States is changing. The press conference yesterday from Tony Blinken, when he said that 100% of people in Gaza are at the risk of famine at this point and that aid must come through. Look, I'm looking for anything I can grab my hands on here to hopefully save some lives, but it was a much more aggressive posture, significantly undercut by him this morning, shaking hands with Netanyahu and smiling for the camera. But still, the United States is inching towards something a bit more reasonable here. It's just how many Palestinians will be massacred and starved to death before
it happens.
Yeah.
We'll also talk about where we're at in terms of the famine that is going on there and the implications of that in just a moment.
But like America, China could break off a trade relationship if they really wanted to put the screws to
Yeah.
Israel, and
There's
not doing
a
that.
multitude of things that we could do that have there is no guarantee that whatever the United States did would influence Israel's actions or Netanyahu's actions. But if that was the standard for action, that you have a guarantee you're going to get the exact outcome you want, no one would do anything. I wouldn't speak into this microphone because there's no guarantee it's actually reaching YouTube. I mean, it's an absurd, that argument with all that leverage left on the table, the idea that this won't impact what they do anyways is just an absurd one. It's just absurd. I mean, honestly, it's absurd.